Welcome back to We Move Through Stormy Weather, a Fish podcast where we compare and contrast songs and the evolution of their jamming styles throughout the band's career. My name is Ryan Storm, and today I am joined by Scott Marks. Scott has been a part of the Fish.net setlist team since 2009 and has been on the board of directors for the Mockingbird Foundation since 2015. From his Biz Archive account on Twitter, Scott provides live updates from Fish shows and Fish content in general to the masses. Scott, you can say hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being on today. Really excited to talk some Fish with you. This has been an episode that I have been looking forward to recording for a while. Huge fan. Been following you for a really long time. I've also been bothering you with teases that I find in jams for a really long time. But yeah, so I'm really excited to chat with you.
Yeah, I'm excited too. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So why don't you talk a little bit about, before we dive into the song that you picked, let's talk a little bit about how you got into Fish.
I got into Fish. I had a friend who had played me Picture of Nectar in spring of '94. And, it's one of those real love at first listen experiences where the first notes of Llama came on and I loved it. And the guitar and Page and just everything. And the rest of the album was the same thing. I just had on CD and listened to it a ton, and then got Junta, and just started getting all the other albums at that point, and graduated to tapes a couple of years later, concert tapes, and saw my first show in Hartford '97, and had wanted to see them for at least a year beforehand before I finally got a chance to, and the rest is history, as they say.
Amazing. How many shows are you at now?
351.
That's the dream right there.
It's been a life well spent and very much enjoyed.
For sure. So you picked Stash to talk about today. This is a song I have been definitely excited to dive into. What made you pick Stash?
So Stash is one of those songs that was also off A Picture of Nectar, and so I've enjoyed it throughout the years. And when it gets really good, like the couple of ones that we're going to go through tonight, it's such a pleasure to experience.
Yeah. So why don't you dive into your pick a little bit? Amsterdam '97.
So I chose the Stash from 7/2/97 on Amsterdam, and what strikes me about this right off the bat is you have a summer that was so funk oriented and dominated, and then you have this Stash which clocks in at over 25 minutes, and there's no funk at all, and it's a fantastic version of improvisation, beautiful melodies, and one of those rare unfinished Stashes because they're so far out they never get back home. And it's always been one of my go-to jams for a long time, and I figured if we're going to talk Stash, that's probably where I wanted to go.
Yeah, to me, it's one that I haven't revisited this jam in a little while, so I'm glad I had the opportunity to. But it's one of my favorite Fish jams of all time. I think one of my favorite, obviously one of my favorite Bliss segments that they've ever done. And Summer '97 is probably my favorite tour of 1.0. I prefer the sound of the summer to the fall. I think there's a more organic sound to the funk, especially, and just to the band in general. It seems like the fall, I don't know, the fall doesn't seem as clean to me, if that makes any sense. But the summer to me, just Trey's tone and how the band sounds. Page exploring his new Yamaha CS60 synth in a lot of the jams. Fishman leading. And one thing that struck me about the early part of this Stash is that it feels like all four band members are trying to lead the jam at the same time, which is really cool because if you go back even a year previously, or even later in the year, you're going to find a lot of jams where it's just Trey pushing ahead and the rest of the band following him. So it's interesting to see, on this Europe '97 tour, how you get moments like that where they're taking that conscious step towards the more democratic improvisation, and all of them are, leading in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, Absolutely. I did feel that Trey was in control for a lot of this stash, but you can definitely hear other pieces involved. And Fish was adding a lot of percussion midway through. And it's like each time you listen to a song like that, you hear something different.
Hmm.
There are certain things that you come back to every time, and then something else is like, oh, I hear that before, even though it's been there the whole time. So you just get a different perspective on it.
Yeah, and I really like the ambient intro that they do before dropping into Stash at the beginning. Very patient stuff, as they tended to do in this era. But it felt to me obviously like a later '90s Ghost intro. With Trey setting up those boomerang like loops.
Yeah,
It
the
was
loop
really
was
cool.
there. You have like 2.5 minutes of noise, ambience, and
Hmm.
some loops, and not as pronounced as you'd have in maybe '99 or 2000 for those long ghost loop intros, but it was definitely a predecessor, if you will.
Hmm. For sure. And it's interesting also how, at around the 2 minute and 10 second mark, the song, Trey starts, backs away from the textural stuff and starts playing some notes. And he's like toying with the Stash riff. He doesn't quite play it, but, he's dancing around it for about a minute before they drop into the jam. And I thought that was a really cool thing.
Yeah, definite foreshadowing. Or if you didn't get the stash, you could have been like, oh, they could have gone there, but they obviously did in the situation.
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah, and then this stash, what's really cool to me about this stash and the one that I picked, which is Shoreline 2021, Fish spends a really big part of the Amsterdam one and all of the Shoreline one keeping that stash hi-hat going. And so it grounds it in the song while the rest of the band is out, like, they could be in a different key, totally different mood, but it still retains that element of stash because of what Fishman is doing. And I think, that's something really amazing to listen to, because with everything that he's doing on the drum kit, he's still keeping that steady hi-hat going basically the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, it took a good 20 minutes for Fish to finally lose
Mm-hmm.
that stash groove. Like you listen, like, is it type two? Is it type two? No, no, 'cause Fish still has that anchor. Then he finally lifts it, and there's no going home at that point.
Yeah. And I mean that Bliss jam that they get into, after Fish lets go of that stash, the hi hat really around the 21 minute mark. Trey gets into that progression, and then Fish catches on and immediately pushes the jam, gives it. To me, it feels like you're like in a boat or something, and then you get like this little wave that just pushes you, and then you start like just moving faster. And it just from there, it's just complete butter for minutes of just this beautiful, beautiful jam, and it's incredible.
It's some of the most beautiful Fish that I've
Ever,
heard. I mean,
yeah,
you have songs that have that beautiful composed part, like the man who stepped into yesterday, and the lizards, and Harry Hood, and then you have a good 3, 4, 5 minutes at the end of the stash where you've had an idea that has started, and then it's grown a bit, and then it kind of veers off in a different direction, but the seeds have already been planted, and then it returns into a full blossom.
yeah, and good thing you mentioned "Man Who Stepped Into Yesterday." Trey kind of sounds like he's almost playing that around 18 minutes and 45 seconds. I was getting that kind of vibe from the kind of licks he was playing. Really reminded me of "Man Who Stepped Into Yesterday," and so I thought that was really cool. There's also a moment a couple of minutes before, around 15:45, where they're playing what I would call it like a Zeppelin like riff. Trey and Page were doing that. That kind of gave that vibe to me. But it's cool when you kind of hear elements of different songs. I wouldn't call it A Man Who Stepped Into Yesterday Tease because Trey doesn't play the riff from it at all, but he's kind of playing in that kind of vein of dreamy repeating lick like that.
Yeah, the notes are in the neighborhood, if you will, but not a true tease per se, but the same type of playing is kind of there a little bit.
It's like Mike's passing through tees in the 10-31-18 tweezer that I've been trying to get notated for 3.5 years. That Dirksen made the executive call that it was not a tease. In the neighborhood of.
A jam akin to, I think, is
Yes.
the special wordage that
And
Mr.
to be
Dirksen
fair,
likes
I
to use.
do, on the goose side of things, I do use that language for a lot of people who are like, "Oh, there's a tease there," and I'm like, "No, it's like not quite."
So for me to put a tease in to .NET, it's more like a musical quote. You have to
Yeah.
have the notes actually there. And so if somebody's teasing it like a real tease, then it's not um, they're just playing notes that are kind of around there. But
Mm-hmm.
a direct musical quote is what I would consider a tease, and then like a verbal quote, they're quoting lyrics. That's a quote.
Yeah, my
So
crowning achievement is finding a cars, trucks, buses tease from Page in the 22803 tweezer last year. I
you've
was
got a few submissions in there.
I have a few, but I think that's my most impressive achievement. Finding something 18 years later. I thought it was really cool.
Oh,
You know,
there's
to,
there's always stuff to discover.
yeah, and and it's cool seeing when you go back and do a deep dive on like 1992 or something, and then as you're going through, you're like finding teases left and right. That weren't there before. It's you listen with a new set of ears and you hear it differently.
Absolutely.
Like think of how many hundreds of times even like you probably listened to the 22803 tweezer. You don't hear something like that, but then and I also listened to it so many times before that moment and didn't hear it, and then it was when we were talking about that tweezer on an episode of the podcast, and so I was listening so closely to it, and then it just like leapt out at me. So it's cool to listen for that kind of thing, and and try to make the distinction between jam akin to and an actual tease.
I think part of it is like oftentimes we'll have music on while we're doing something else,
Yeah.
and you're listening to it, but you're not listening to it. As opposed to like you're sitting on the couch, you have a pair of headphones on with no other distractions, and you're listening to it, and then all of a sudden you're paying a little more attention than you might have normally done. That's not to say that you could still catch a tease that you didn't hear,
Mm-hmm.
driving in the car or whatever. But the more you focus on something, the better chance you might find something. I think.
Yeah, and yeah, you catch it in all different places. Like even when like we're listening to the show, it's just really cool to listen for those kinds of things. Then draw the map of how common is this tease? Does it pop up anywhere else? Like something like a San Jose or Streets of Cairo, stuff like that pops up everywhere. Um, it's really cool. Teases are fun.
Once Trey gets a riff on his brain,
It's
you'll
it's
find it
there.
all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah, last year there was mountain jam everywhere, especially in the later half of the year, I think. Uh, Gorge through the fall.
Yeah, there are a couple instances where that riff definitely showed up.
Yeah, it's teasing's fun. Back to the stash. It was a solid tangent. We're doing well. Another thing that stuck out to me in this version, is just how incredibly fluid, Fishman's drum playing is, and how he's not the type of drummer that plays in like a tight groove, which isn't a bad thing. Most drummers will when they play, they're in a groove and they're in a defined time signature and they're playing in that groove. And while Fish improvises in 4/4 the majority of the time, it's not as plain as just like to non-musicians who hear it. It doesn't just sound like a tight groove because of how Fishman drums. And I mean, I may be speaking out of my ass here because I'm a musician and I hear the time signature when I'm playing. I'm just spitballing here. Um, but the way he plays is so cool because there's so much space in his groove and his beat and what he's playing, and he just seems everywhere on the kit at once, which is remarkable.
I found it interesting um, when you're comparing shows that are 24 years apart. Um, like Fishman's there in '97, but like listening to that other stash from Shoreline, which we'll get to, uh, he was a lot more in control of the jam. I thought in that stash, but
Mm-hmm.
also for me, I saw a bunch of shows last year, and I kept gravitating toward what Fish was doing, which may have always been there, but again, your ears pick up different things as you progress,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes you're more tuned into one musician than another. But I just noticed that Fish was driving so many of the jams last year, especially that stash.
Yeah, in the stash, like there are certain moments where it actually sounds like he has a second percussionist with him. Like it's just unbelievable listening to that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like last year was such an incredible year for Fish. He was more assertive than in jams than I think we've ever seen. He's always been obviously an incredible drummer, but last year was like taking it to another level. And as I say in every episode, a band in their 38th year, taking it to another level, and Fishman being, the age that he is, like he's not playing with the speed, maybe that his, mid 90s self was playing with, but he, there was a discussion on Twitter recently, like which members of Fish could still hang with their, like 1995 selves, and I think Fishman more than could. Like I think Page and Mike as well. Obviously Trey, not as much, but Fishman could more than hold up to himself from 25 years ago in terms of just incredible drumming.
I could see that for sure.
Like what he's lost in just straight speed, he's gained in complexity and fluidity and just utilizing the drums as more of um, something to lead the jam as opposed to tying the jam together, which obviously it still does. But it's, he's taken on a different role in the band, as all of them have as their jamming has evolved. But I think, Fishman's a really interesting case to look at because he doesn't have the melodic component that Page and Mike do, when they've stepped up, in the modern era and led jams more, instead of Trey taking the lead on all of them. So it's really cool to look at.
It's it's definitely neat to see how everything evolves and to see who's in control at any given point.
Yeah. So more in this stash. I really like the post Bliss Jam, when they do that few minutes of like space and scuzz, I like to call it. Page, he's using the Moog Source synthesizer, I believe here, not the CS60. So that's the one that he's had since '94 at this point. But it's really cool. Trey with like this just like low droning sound, and you know, oh, and Mike had a bass solo. I totally skipped over Mike's bass solo. That was really cool. What do you think of the bass solo?
I think we need more bass solos.
Especially if they sound like this, absolutely. Like really, really, really cool vibe, especially sticking with that Bliss progression as, the other three band members quiet down and almost drop out as Mike just leads it. And it does sound like he puts down the pick and switches to finger style for a while in here.
Now you're going beyond my brass knowledge of music. I don't know a ton about guitar or bass playing, but I'll
I just
take
know the
your word
difference.
for it.
It's finger picking versus using a pick, and so it has a different sound.
Sure.
Um, But yeah, no, it's really, really cool. I kind of described around the 28-minute mark as like an angry cloud appearing on the horizon. As it's kind of coming in very ominous, kind of, and it takes over from the Bliss segment, which is already a cool juxtaposition from where they were earlier in the jam, and then I immediately went in and listened to Shoreline, which is even further in that dark, uh, you know, synthed out space. And obviously, they have the benefit of their 2021 effects and instruments. So there's a wider range of sonic palettes they can get to, but it's really cool, to hear the difference in how they approach a jam like that, 1997 versus 2021.
Well, and you look at how weird of a start it goes into Llama. You don't
Right,
see a lot of songs having a jam going into Llama. Llama usually just starts right off the bat, and this kind of builds and builds and builds, and there it is.
right.
So it's an interesting transition between the two songs.
Yeah,
Kind of that
especially with
that
just
post Bliss.
yeah, especially with Trey just hammering that opening chord to Llama out of this cloud of space. Um, yeah, it's really cool, and it happens really fast as well.
Yeah, I've listened to this set and this show. I mean, the first set's uh, no slouch either. I mean, I love when a Mike song opens a show. Um, and so, yeah, when you're looking at really a 4 song second set, um, which we don't get those too often. So, no, it's easier to do when you have like almost a 30-minute stash to open things up. But
Right.
um, it's it's a it's great, but it's also weird. That Wormtown jam in the middle,
So
um,
weird.
and
I mean, it's also it's technically a 3-song second set because one of the tracks is Wormtown Jam.
well,
So is that a song?
it's kind of Swingtown from
Kind
Steve
of,
Miller Band.
I
So,
guess.
but they called it Wormtown instead. But I guess it depends on who you ask. We have it on Fishnet as a 4 song set. Uh, Live Fish has it
Has it tracked out as
as
4 songs?
okay.
Yeah, it has Stash Llama, Wormtown, Velvet Sea. Um,
Yep.
but yeah, it's interesting to look at things like that as well. Like, is 12:30:19 a 4-song second set? Um,
Ah,
there are four
lots of
songs
controversy on
played,
that one.
but they go back into 2 of them. So does it count? I'm of the mind that it is a 4-song second set, because they play 4 songs. I wouldn't call, dropping into the tweezer riff and then jamming for 2 minutes a 5th song, and then Ruby Waves by extension there. Like, but interesting. What are your thoughts on that one?
So my thoughts aren't going to change your thoughts or anyone else's thoughts.
Of course, that's
Walking
what
down the
Fish
street.
fans are like.
Yep. Um, if you ask me, I think it's a 6 song set. Because you have transitions going back and forth. There are 4 unique songs that are played, but there are 6 songs total. Um, so I would not consider that to be a true 4 song set like they did in Mexico or they did last fall or a couple times in '97 and throughout history. But hey, that's just
Just a
my opinion.
couple in '97. I feel like
Yeah,
there are
just a few.
a ton. Yeah, no, and it's cool when something like that happens too. Like San Francisco last fall. That's an incredible set. Mexico from just recently this past February. Really, really incredible. Were you in Mexico?
I was not.
Oh, okay, I couldn't remember if you were there or not. But that
No.
is a really phenomenal set. I haven't really spoken about that run as much, and I haven't gone back into it as many times as I would have liked because I've been analyzing Goose Tour for the last month. But I've gone back to that set a few times, and just all 4 of the songs are just like perfectly placed. The jams are incredible, and it's really cool because by this indication, I think we're going to see a continuation of the fire from 2021 coming back this year. just based on the spaces they reached in these improv in the improvisation, not only in this set but across the 4 nights. Trey's playing still seems to be really confident. Page adding a new synth to his rig is always a good thing. Yeah. What were your thoughts on Mexico?
I thought the jams were fantastic. They've stepped it up the last few years they've played down there. I felt like
Mm-hmm.
the first year or two wasn't really a you snooze you lose type of thing. And all of a sudden the bust outs started coming out, and the 20-minute jams started coming out.
Yeah.
Um, and as polarizing as it was this year, I mean, you had Dave Matthews coming out on stage for the first time
I
since
loved that.
1995. From a Fish historical standpoint, it's a very special thing that happened because you know these are two major touring bands that do not play in the same place at the same time, and to kind of have the streams crossing a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
Ghostbusters, if you will. I thought it was a cool thing to witness, and then I was a bit surprised that Dave Matthews had never actually played a Fish song with Fish.
Mm-hmm.
And so then he's doing like the Tweezer reprise. He'd done Bathtub Gin and Waste, on his own, but to actually sit in with Fish and do that. And then you had the Maker that had been played since '94 with Fish. Um, so I feel like those are once in a lifetime experiences that people have gotten a chance to see, like the Shafty shenanigans in 2020, or Sea and Sand that had been played since '95, or Willin, which hadn't shown up since the Halloween show.
Who Loves the Sun getting played, Spock's Brain getting busted out.
And you try not to go into shows looking for bust outs or jams, but they've certainly treated the fans that have been down there these last few years to something a little above average,
Yeah, and then
if you
expanding it
will.
to a 4 night run was really cool as well. I think definitely, as you mentioned, they really raised the bar for the 2019 run. I feel like 2016 is more surprising, than anything coming off of a great year like 2015. That they wouldn't have thrown down a bit harder for the first Mexico run. 2017, kind of was a very, fall 2016 run. Like there were some bright spots. That 115-17 show is like a dream on paper. Um, which is always crazy to me because, it doesn't really have any meaningful jams. Like, I don't think anything's even over 15 minutes, but it's like they were like, okay, we're going to play all the hits in one show. You've got like Tweezer, Bowie, Carini, Hood, everything.
Well, that and by the time 2019 came around, you had some monster jams that were showing up in the set lists.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you had asked, or you had talked about if the trend from fall 2021 is going to go into this summer or not. And I don't know if it's a foregone conclusion. Like she didn't really have it at the ninth cube, so they could really go either way.
It's
It could
true.
have just been a continuation from the fall, or it could have been, hey, we're gonna do the fall type stuff because it's Mexico. You'll have a good idea by the time South Carolina shows up
Mm-hmm.
in the first leg, and then maybe by Bethel in the second leg as to which direction they're going to go. Um, the years of Fish are not always even in
True.
terms of memorable jams or playing. There are certain years like summer 2015 and the Baker's Dozen in 2017, which to me stand out more than 2016 or 2018. It's not to say that 2016, 2018 were bad years, but for me, there are certain years or certain runs that kind of stand out head and shoulders above others. And
Right.
I always say that one person's trash, another person's treasure. So somebody else might not like the jams going 20 minutes or 25 minutes or 15. They kind of want shorter, more contained stuff, more songs. So every fan's going to be a little different in what he or she wants going into a show.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, anyone who knows me knows I'm a huge 2018 guy. I'm a big fan of 2018 Fish, and I see why people don't like it as much. Like Trey's tone in 2018, not ideal. A lot of sloppy playing, but I think the jams that they were getting into that year really, you know, pushing to expand past what they hit at the Baker's Dozen and really find a new vein of creativity, which is really cool to do. Like once you've hit another in a huge line of career peaks like they've done after doing 13 nights, 237 songs, then be like, okay, where do we go from here? And there was a lot of high expectations on summer 2018 because of the Baker's Dozen. And I think they definitely didn't live up to a lot of people's high expectations. But I think really fall 2018 was a huge step up from the summer. A ton of incredible jams coming every show. First set jamming really
Oh,
coming back
the simple in Hampton,
consistently.
especially.
Yes.
Um, I mean, I think it was more of a consistency thing, where you could go at 2015 by the end of July, where they were night in, night out, they were having these jams.
Hmm.
And obviously 2017, where when you're doing the Baker's Dozen and you're kind of confined into that 13 show realm, well, you're going to play 300 songs, you're going to do 237, you're going to jam out things that don't normally get jammed out, like Steep, um, or MoMA Dance. I think I got jammed out a little bit, but things like that, Long Boy, and then Sample, where you're going to see things that are kind of played out of the norm.
Hmm.
And I felt like while there weren't, it wasn't the no repeat type of experience in 2021 fall tour. There were a lot of similarities I felt between the Baker's Dozen and that fall tour, where you didn't know what you were going to get every night. I mean, you never know what you're going to get every night, but again, you'd have songs that were jammed out, like Fluffhead and ICU.
Every
Um,
song.
yeah,
555 finally getting jammed out,
oh
after
yeah,
all this
in
time.
Vegas, the Axel Part Two, where
Exila, yeah.
Trey was like, let's jam this, and we did.
NICU, Free getting jammed again after so long. Like, yeah, I agree with that as well. It felt like every night was jam filled night. And they also, I feel like last year they didn't go with the set list calls that you would expect most nights, which is also cool. They only played Tweezer 3 times throughout the summer. 2001 was only played a few times the entire year. And then I remember in fall tour, like, I'm part of this like little like fish bingo game where we do like a bingo card for the set list every night. And I remember just not doing as well because you'd go and be like, oh, it's been like, 6 shows since they last played Mercury. Like they'll play Mercury, and then they only played it in Sacramento, and then not for the rest of the tour.
They, I mean, you have certain rules that you can apply where the disease will be played like every 3 shows or whatever, and all of a sudden, with a tour like that, the rules kind of get thrown out.
Hmm.
Um, and now, I mean, you're looking at more of the newer songs, like Life Beyond the Dream. You could probably count on being played at every 3 shows.
I but
Miracle While
I
You're Sleeping,
figured. I
but
figured I never needed you like this before was going to get played, sometime in Vegas or, Santa Barbara, but didn't get played after San Francisco. So crazy.
that's definitely going to be around for good, though. I don't see it going away anytime
Oh,
soon.
not yeah. Love that song.
That Arkansas, I mean, for them to come back with that song, it just seems so appropriate.
Hmm.
Where with the hiatus and with the breakup, that was the band's choice, and the band didn't have a choice regarding with the COVID, and
Hmm.
so you can look at it in a real meaningful way that really did never need you like this before.
Right.
You never realize what you have until you lose it.
Yeah, and from that, now that we're talking about 2021, let's talk a little bit about the Shoreline Stash.
Oh, a
We
very
all
nice
we always
segue,
find our
Ryan
way
Storm.
we find our way back eventually. It always comes back in a circle. So Shoreline Stash. This is 2021 on full display right here. Trey digging into his new synthy pedals, both that bass synth and the crazy envelope filter. Page on synth for less of the jam than I would have expected. Just going in, just looking in the context of 2021. He resists the synth for a while. Stays on piano for a good chunk. And yeah, as we mentioned before, talking about Fishman, he anchors it with that stash hi hat throughout the whole thing. So can you still call it Type 2? Probably not. But is this still an absolutely incredible stash? Yes.
I think it's still got to Type 2 around 6:30.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it took a
Which
little
is
bit to get there,
also
but
which
you
is
know,
also really cool because they've pretty much departed the song a minute into the jam.
for me, I don't see a lot of stashes these days showing up like the ones from the, the mid 90s. Um,
Mm-hmm.
8/15/93, 6/17/95. Orlando, which is different because it goes weaving in and out of songs. And then obviously Amsterdam. And while the Shoreline stash didn't quite get to those levels, I think it stood head and shoulders above a lot of the other stashes that have been played in the last several years.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So, I oftentimes when I fill up my phone with music, I'm not going to put entire shows on there because I'm going to run out of space on my phone.
I have
But
my
this
phone's 256 gigs. I'm like closing in on the point where I'm gonna have to start calling things.
I'm getting there. I have a 256 also, but the stash definitely made it onto the phone from that show. So it was easy for me to pull up when I was doing my own deep dive for this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it was definitely one of the highlights of the show for me, and a highlight of that first set. And anytime Stash is showing up as a highlight, you're having a good night. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, it was like an appetizer for that second set with Soul Planet, which I think the whole tour was an appetizer at that point in terms of length of songs. But I was so happy to have a stash that kind of got out there a bit, um, and it really, really showcased Fishman in so many spots. It
Oh
was
yeah.
just a perfect example of Fish 2021 right there in that song.
Yeah, to me, he's doing this really cool thing earlier in the jam, like starting around 5.5 minutes. It sounds like he's like galloping, but it's only on the ride cymbal, so it doesn't have that like driving force that it would have if he was doing it on the full kit. But it kind of adds a really interesting vibe for it, for sure. And then Trey, as I mentioned before, using those synth tones, doing really really cool stuff, and gets like low and then high, and he's kind of all over the place. Page introducing these gentle synth swells throughout while he's sticking to piano. Just really incredible work from all four of them.
Yeah, Trey, I noticed twice in the jam that Trey switched his sound. Like around 6 minutes in, and then close to 14 minutes in. So you're used to like that regular guitar sound. All of a sudden, it's completely flipped on its head, and then goes back and forth and back and forth. So it adds another element to the jam that you're not necessarily expecting or used to.
Yeah, for sure. What's interesting, also a really cool sound from this jam is Trey. He adds some Leslie into his tone around just after the 11-minute mark, and normally when he uses it, he's going for more of a textural vibe. Like if you think of something like the Deer Creek Simple, the way he uses it there just adds that more spacey vibe to it as it gets thrown around uh, by the Leslie.
With since we're talking around that spot in the stash around 11 minutes in, um, is one of my favorite things about that stash, and really about fish in general. So just before that 11-minute mark, Trey latches onto a groove where he has a high note and several descending notes, and he repeats it a few times. And I find it really interesting to see if like a real riff is going to develop.
Mm-hmm.
Like you take the 9-6-15 down disease from Dix, or the Piper a couple songs later, where you have an idea and then it progresses. And I mean, you can go back to the 1797 stash as well, where it shows up and then it comes back a few minutes later and it's there for a few minutes. Um, Humphreys McGee has these Legos where they'll have jams or Jimmy Stewart's that may or may not turn into songs later on, or they just might be unofficially teased like a couple years before they become actual songs. Fish doesn't really. I mean, there's no Jimmy Stewart's for Fish, but
I mean, they do
you
have jams that do end up turning into songs.
right. I mean, there are definitely pre teases that
Yeah,
like Julius was teased before it became a song.
right. Or I mean, Whack
Waiting
Tube was
All Night
born.
from Deer Creek was a couple years before. So
Yeah,
there are definite examples.
Whack Tube
Um,
being born out of the Camden 2018 Light.
yep.
That jam.
And Suskin Hotel was teased a couple times in '99, and then that doesn't show up until years later with Grab, and then I mean even years and years later for Fish.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely there where you have an idea that's floating around in your brain, and you play the riff, and then you're like, oh, I'm gonna make a song out of this. Then it shows up years later. I'm not saying that you're gonna see a song developing out of that stash or out of the the Dick's disease, but it is interesting to see where Trey sometimes has so many ideas going on in his head where he's going to do this for 30 seconds, that for 30 seconds, to actually stop and focus on a groove and let it develop. I don't think it happens a whole lot, but when it does, it's one of the coolest things that Fish does.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. Another thing I really like in this jam, I think this might be, I don't know if he used it earlier in the set. This might be the first instance of Trey using his like phone dialing effect. The one that came about. I think he just added it to the rig at Shoreline. That kind of one that really the simple catapult meat stick from Dick's. You know which one I'm talking about. It's hard to describe the tone beyond it sounding like him dialing a phone. But it's a really cool effect and how it kind of treats the notes he plays. And I don't know exactly what it
I
does or
think
what
I know
the.
what you're talking about.
Yeah,
I didn't catch it, or if I did catch it, I didn't know what I was catching when I listened to it.
I think this might be like a
I
ring modulator or something. I don't know enough about
no,
guitar effects.
I'm picturing the catapult meat stick, which is more fresh on my mind from the Dick's show.
It's more in the
Um,
meat stick, I think.
it was somewhere around there.
Yeah, but
Everything
that's a
kind of
really
got
cool sound.
blended together on that show.
Mm-hmm. It happens.
Yep.
But yeah, no, it's a really cool effect, and again, looking back on the Amsterdam stash, where really Trey's only effect was were his delays and his whammy pedal. And here you have this full range of different octave pedals, synth pedals, envelope filters, what have you. And Page having so many more synths at his disposal, and then all of them having an additional 24 years of playing and experience. they obviously approach these jams in very different ways. And I think both of them are good examples of them finding an idea and exploring it really well.
Well,
You know.
there are definitely more toys at their disposal now than there were in the early '90s.
Hmm.
Trey did have his own mini keyboard in '99, so I mean, there were things, but now I think there's definitely a lot more. Um, some things are more prevalent than others with Trey and his new devices, and I mean Page has. I don't think he always had the clavinet.
Yeah,
Now,
he got
obviously,
that in late '94.
yep. I mean, he also has um, his sound bites, which he likes to use quite a bit.
Hmm.
Um, so,
Yeah,
and
and
Fish now
and
too.
also in the Shoreline Stash, the return to the song is very smooth. And it's cool because it just at around 15 minutes 20 seconds it just kind of falls, the space and the machine noises that were happening just kind of fall away and we're back in Stash.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to Stash, and then they threw a little bit of Allman Brothers in there, which I thought was cool. I mean, you're talking
Hmm.
about Mountain Jam, or if you want to be specific, Donovan's There's a Mountain, but everyone calls it Mountain Jam. And then all of a
Yep.
sudden you have In Memory of Elizabeth Reed showing up there a little after 16 minutes.
i
Um,
I didn't hear that.
so
Okay, well, I after we finish recording I am going to go listen to that again because I
if you go to
didn't hear it.
1605 in,
Can't believe I missed that.
it's like da 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 da. So it's
Yeah.
1605 in there. And to anybody still listening, I apologize for using a little bit of my singing voice there.
Oh, it's good.
It's not my
It's
not my
it's
day job,
relevant.
and there's a reason why.
When I think of an In Memory of Elizabeth Reed tease, I think of the 10/28/18 Plasma, where he plays like the melody, more of like that build thing. So it's cool. Also, on the topic of teases we were talking about earlier, teasing different parts of a song and not just like the riff you'd expect.
Right. No, you definitely have the main riff of Elizabeth Reed that you would expect, and then all of a sudden there's that lead in,
Hmm.
that build that gets teased instead,
Yeah,
like right before the main riff that you'd recognize. So,
it's really cool.
I mean, I was listening and looking at the cell list, and I was like, I don't remember this, and then like, oh, there it is. Um, so that was thrown in toward the end um, as well.
Yeah, well, really amazing stuff, and I think that's a good place to wrap up. It's been an absolute pleasure talking stash and fish with you today, Scott. Thank you so much for coming on. Looking forward to meeting you at MSG in April. Very excited for
Look
those
forward to meeting
shows.
you as well, Ryan. Thank you
Thank you.
so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you to everybody for listening to this episode. It's good to be back doing some fish content. I'm excited to bring you more of these in the coming weeks, as well as continuing with the wonderful goose content that we have started. Always almost there. But I hope everybody enjoyed this episode. We moved through stormy weather. Thank you so much for listening. Have a fantastic day. See you next time.